Hey, my name is Matt Poole, and this is Unapologetically Catholic, the podcast where we dive into the different doctrines, dogmas, and beliefs of the Catholic faith to help explain why I personally am unapologetically Catholic and why I think that you should be too. And this week's episode is, after a very long break, the third in the four-part series of the Marian dogmas. So this week I'm going to be talking about the Assumption of Mary, why it matters, maybe a little bit of evidence and history of it, and why this is not some random invention of the 1950s that the Catholic Church just decided to pull out of thin air because they can. So that's what we're talking about this week. So if you don't already know, you probably already know, but if you don't, I have an Instagram page where you can follow along at Unapologetically Catholic Pod on Instagram. I am here on YouTube if you're not watching the YouTube video, and if you're watching the YouTube video, I have a podcast where you can just listen to this instead of watching it. So I also have Patreon. I've got all kinds of different things. I'll link to it. I appreciate all of your support. If it's your first time here, thank you for being here. And if you're a returned visitor, thank you for returning once again. I hope to be more consistent from here on out, but maybe I'll explain why I've been inconsistent if you don't already know. But with all of that, let's get right into it. Okay, so I think maybe a good place to start off is why I've been gone for a month and a half. And if you follow me on Instagram, you already know. If you don't, then I'm gonna let you know here. So we had some water damage in our kitchen, in our house, and we had to move out into an Airbnb for I think it was a month, right at a month, somewhere around there. So that has been a pain. We are 99.9% completely back, and so it's kind of hard to do YouTube videos and podcast when you're not in your own home and things are insane. We had to remove all of the flooring in almost all of our house, completely redo the kitchen. It was a mess. Thankfully, it was all covered under insurance, so we're back to normal now. But that's not why you're here. Why you're here is to learn about the Assumption of Mary. So this is one that, and I think probably almost everyone is familiar, but if you're not familiar, I am a convert from Protestantism to Catholicism. I grew up Protestant in a Southern Baptist Reformed Calvinistic church that was actually very anti-Catholic. Then went to a Presbyterian church for a while that was, again, mostly Calvinistic and definitely Reformed. But they were not anti-Catholic. They had their issues with the Catholic Church and reasons why I should not become Catholic, and weren't really overly thrilled that I was leaving to become a Catholic, but they weren't calling me a heretic. And so I myself had plenty of disagreements with the Catholic Church. I don't know that I would have ever called Catholicism heresy, but I definitely thought there's enough problems here that, I will not become Catholic. I cannot become Catholic. But now here I am. And this is one of the ones that Mary was bodily assumed into heaven that I just thought was maybe a strange thing. It was weird, and it seemed like a power grab from the Catholic Church to make this a dogma. So if you don't already know, this is one of the four dogmas or one of the four Marian dogmas, which a dogma is something that is declared that absolutely must be believed if you are going to be a faithful Catholic. You can't reject this. And this is one that did not become dogmatized until the 1950s. It may be 1950 when this was dogmatized, which is very far removed from the time of Jesus and the disciples. So just as a brief to kind of this podcast, I don't want this episode to be strictly about dogmas and doctrines developing and things like that over the time, but I do think it's helpful, especially if you don't have a background in this and you're maybe not as familiar as to what I'm referring to. So this doctrine, like I said, or this was dogmatized in the 1950s. That does not mean that this was not believed before the year 1950, though. This is something that we can see back until the year, as early as the year like 350. Some early church fathers write about these things in their homilies. They refer to these things in the early church. It's one of the earliest feast days within the church. So this is not something that was made up in 1950. And it's the same thing with all dogmas. They are dogmatized at different times throughout the history of the church for different reasons. I don't know why it was decided that in 1950 it should be dogmatized. I mean, I know there was reasons. So there was, the world was just coming out of wars, and it was I think it was Pope Pius the 12th who had said basically something along the lines of, we're dogmatizing this to help people in their devotion to the Blessed Mother, to help run to her in these trying, terribly, awfully scary times. So that, I know that is at least part of it, but why didn't the church dogmatize it before the 1950s? I'm not sure. I don't know why. But I just know that the 1950s was the time for it to be dogmatized. A good analogy that I like to use is thinking about like rules that I have. So I have 6 children altogether. One of them is my 16-year-old niece that we have guardianship over. And then the other 5 are my wife and I's children. So my 16-year-old niece obviously is 16 years old. So I'm not going to tell my 3-year-old the same thing that I'm going to tell my 16-year-old, right? I'll tell the 16-year-old, you better be home by midnight. But I'm not going to tell the 3-year-old, you better be home by midnight. There's no reason for me to. It doesn't make sense. The 3-year-old will never be out till midnight. He doesn't have a car. He doesn't drive. None of that rule is still the same for everyone, but there's no reason for me to say that to the 3-year-old. But there's absolutely a reason for me to say that to the 16-year-old. The 16-year-old has a car. She has friends. She has a license. She goes and does things. So I need to tell her now at this time, you need to be home by midnight. The 3-year-old, not so much. But there will come a day when I do need to say that to him as well. And it's the same thing with things being dogmatized within the church. Maybe there's a reason that it wasn't. Like I said, I don't know why it wasn't dogmatized before. I know the reasons why it was dogmatized in the 1950s. But yeah, hopefully that helps clarify some misunderstandings when it comes to dogmas and doctrines developing over times and things. The fullness of the revelation came with Jesus. There is no new revelation. The church doesn't just make things up for one reason or the other. The church can authoritatively recognize truth, but they cannot make truth, because truth, goodness, beauty, all of these things come from God, but someone has to authoritatively recognize those things, and that's the role of the church. That's why Jesus established an authoritative church before he left to go back to his heavenly kingdom. Anyways, that was a big long side tangent, and I apologize for doing that. But, so the Assumption of Mary, I have a episode kind of on this topic a little bit, but I've not really gone over this topic in detail. I have an episode where I talk about the ascension of Jesus and the Assumption of Mary and how they differ and how they're somewhat related. But I think that's maybe a good place to start. So the Assumption of Mary, if you don't know, means that we Catholics understand and recognize that Mary was body and soul taken up into heaven. So right this very moment, whenever you're listening to this or watching this, Mary is in heaven, body and soul, with Jesus and the angels and the rest of the saints and God and everyone else in heaven. Mary is body and soul there with them. Now, I believe in that episode where I talk about the difference between the ascension of Jesus and the assumption of Mary, I made a mistake. So the church does not say. Now, some people will say, okay, well, either she did not die and she was just walking along one day or sitting at her house, and then all of a sudden she just was taken up into heaven, body and soul, right? Never died or anything. There are other people who will say that Mary did die, but at the moment of her death or after death, her body and soul were taken into heaven. The church doesn't really make a definitive call one way or the other. Really, the only thing that the church says is, no, Mary, right now, the point that matters, at least to the church, is that Mary right now is body and soul in heaven at this moment. How she got there, maybe not. It's open for debate and open for discussion. Now, this is not something that is foreign to happening. We see this happen before in the Old Testament. It's not like someone being assumed into heaven is some kind of foreign concept that we never see with anyone except for Jesus. And that kind of leads me to this point about the difference between the ascension of Jesus and the assumption of Mary. I know I said I had a podcast episode on this previously, but I think it would be worth revisiting, especially since I'm doing a podcast episode on the assumption of Mary. So, Jesus ascended into heaven in and of himself. So, we all, Christians, if you rightly recognize who Jesus is, you understand that Jesus is fully God, but he is also fully man. He's not a little bit of one and a little bit of the other, or mostly one and kind of part of the other. He is completely fully man and fully God. So yes, he is body and soul in heaven right now as we speak. He is completely, his whole being is in heaven right now. Whereas most Christians who have died are in heaven in spirit, and by their souls are in heaven right now, waiting the resurrection of the body, right? Where one day the body and the soul will be reunited and be in heaven for all of eternity, enjoying the being in the presence of God and the angels and saints and Jesus and Mary. So Jesus was able to ascend into heaven by his own nature, because of who he is. He didn't need any help. He didn't need anyone's assistance. He didn't need anything because he is God. So he ascended into heaven in and of his own power, strength, will, and because of who he is. Mary was assumed, and this is the reason why the church makes the distinction between the words ascension and assumption. Mary was assumed into heaven because she is not God. Assumed gives this indication that you can't do it on your own. You're being brought to heaven by something else, by someone else. And it's the same as we've seen in the past in the Old Testament. God brings these people up into heaven. And it would be the same with Mary. Mary was brought into heaven by the grace of God. This is not something that Mary was just good enough, she was a great enough person, or because she was perfect in and of her own will, that she ascended into heaven in the same way that Jesus ascended into heaven. Absolutely not. If Mary were to be left to her own devices to get herself to heaven without the grace or help of God, she would not be there. Just like any other Christian who makes it to heaven would not be in heaven if it were not for the grace of God. Now, God does give his grace in different degrees to different people. And obviously, God called Mary to a role that he has not ever called any Christian to in the past, and in the future will never call any other Christian to ever, because Mary was the one who was called to do something that no one could ever do. And that's why we see things done to, through, and in her that was never done to anyone else. So one of them is that Mary remained completely sinless her entire life. She was conceived without sin. And the other is Mary remaining a perpetual virgin from the moment of conception to after the birth of Jesus and throughout the rest of her life, remained a virgin her entire life. And as we see today, Mary is bodily assumed into heaven, body and soul assumed into heaven. Those things are something that, as far as we know, those things are something that has not happened to any other Christian. Why? Because no other Christian brought God into the world in the same way that Mary brought God into the world. Again, not through her own will, not because she's good enough, not because she's great enough, but because of the grace of God alone. So if we look at the Ark of the Old Covenant, we can see some connection to Mary as the Ark of the New Covenant. And I think this, obviously, there's no assumption of the Ark of the Covenant. But there is some connections that we see throughout these different aspects of the Ark of the Old Covenant and Mary being the Ark of the New Covenant. One of them is when Mary goes to greet Elizabeth after the annunciation of the angel Gabriel to Mary. Elizabeth uses almost the same exact wording that David uses when the Ark of the Old Covenant comes into his presence. Elizabeth says nearly the same thing. And and there's other connections there, but that's one that I think is important to call out. There's obviously, with the Ark of the Old Covenant, there's a very particular, very specific way that God wanted the Ark of the Covenant made. He gave very strict instructions, he told the people how he made it known for certain how he wanted the Ark of the Covenant made, and it was perfect. It was perfectly made. It was made with wood, and I talk about this in the episode where I talk about, I think I do, how the Ark of the Covenant is made with, I believe it's acacia wood, and acacia wood is known to not decay, not rot, not have any kind of bug infestations, anything like that. And we can kind of see that with Mary being the Ark of the New Covenant, that there's some connections there with Mary being completely sinless. But if we continue this, connection of Ark of the Old Covenant, Ark of the New, and we kind of think through some of these other Marian dogmas that we've already talked to, one kind of leads to the other. They all are intertwined and they all connect to each other. And this is a perfect point. So one of the major things that comes from the fall of Adam and Eve is that mankind faces death. Nearly every human being on the face of the planet has faced or will face death. It's just it's a known fact. You and I both are going to die, likely, at some point. But Mary, and this is because of the fall of Adam and Eve. This is a result of the fall. But if, as the church recognizes, Mary has been kept free from the stain of original sin and then kept free from sin her entire life, then it would follow that the result of the fall of Adam and Eve being death, Mary would not taste the sting of death. She would not experience death in the same way that you and I do. Now, you may say, well, yeah, but Jesus died, and he faced the sting of death. And I would say, yes, he absolutely did die. He did not die in the same way all other human beings do. We have a death where at the moment of death, our soul is separated from our body, and our body waits in the ground or in wherever you're buried. Your body waits to be one day reunited with your soul. This is something that Jesus does not now experience the separation of his body and soul. The two are The two are one. And it's the same with Mary. Yes, Mary maybe did die. Like I had said earlier, the church doesn't make a declaration on whether Mary actually died or she just was, like I said, before even closing her eyes in death, was completely taken up into the sky. It's possible. But either way, whether that is what happened or not, her body is with her soul right now in heaven. So now why does all this matter? What is the purpose? Why does the church make it such a big deal? And I've said this with all of the other, or the two other Marian dogmas that I've talked about. But every Marian dogma says more about Mary or God than it does about Mary herself. It points to Mary always points us to Christ. And this is something, I mean, to be honest with you, when I first became a Catholic, I have said this before, I had some issues with some of the Marian dogmas still. And I thought, this is one of the ones that I thought that they're just not making these things up, but they're making these things dogmas. And I don't know, maybe they matter, but it just seems like they don't matter. But the church says I have to believe it. And I mean, I've seen people in the Old Testament be assumed into heaven, so sure, okay, that's fine. But I never really looked into it any more than that, until some more recently. And now I understand why the church has made these things dogmas. Like I said, they say more about Christ, and Mary always points us to Christ. And I had heard that before and thought, yeah, that sounds nice, but I don't really get it. But the more I've learned, the more I see. So Mary is the perfect disciple, right? She is the prime example. If you want to know how to be a disciple, look to Mary. If you want to know what a absolutely perfect disciple looks like, look to Mary. Mary is the place to go. Mary's the person to imitate. Mary is the one to follow if you're looking for a disciple to completely mimic. So Mary lived a sinless life, was the best disciple, and what is the reward of those who continue until the end, those who persevere until the end? Well, the reward for those Christians who persevere into the end is that one day they will be in heaven with God and Jesus and the saints for all of eternity. They will be able to have the beatific vision, right, at some point. And now, in a sense, or now for Christians, not in a sense, but now for most Christians, when we die, our soul goes to heaven, but our bodies are left here on the earth. Mary is the prime example of what to look forward to, of what Christ can and will do. So as I said earlier in this episode, Jesus bodily ascended to heaven in and of his own power by the nature of who he is. Mary was brought to heaven, was assumed to heaven by God, and not having anything to do with her own nature or her own will. Because again, if it was up to her, she would not be able to do these things. But because of what God has done in her, she was able to be brought to heaven. So Mary was able to be assumed into heaven by the grace of God. And it's something that we get to look forward to. I am strictly a human being. Yes, Jesus raised from the dead and ascended into heaven, and I get to look forward to that. But Jesus didn't leave us with just the example of himself, because then someone could easily argue, oh, okay, well, if you Christians say that you're going to be brought to heaven one day and Jesus is your example, there's a big difference between you and Jesus. Jesus is God, you are not. You make the claim that Jesus is God, so, what other kind of evidence do you have? Well, we've been given more evidence, and the more evidence that we have is that Mary is the strictest. Sorry, I got myself all excited. Mary is the first human being of the new covenant to be able to have the fullness of that reward of persevering until the end. Mary was taken completely bodily into heaven, as you and I will hopefully one day be able to join her and everyone else in heaven with our body and our soul. We are made body soul composites. We're not just a soul that's entrapped in this bad, bodily cage, and one day we get to break out of this body, and then we'll be fully truly who we were made to be, or something like that. That's not what we believe. We recognize that God made the body good, and he also made the soul good. And both of those things now are, obviously, because of original sin, have been corrupted, and have defects and have issues and problems. And all of those things are a result of the fall. But when we look to Mary, we can see, no, God really did make the body good. And he desires for us to be body and soul in heaven with him for all of eternity. She's the one who got to experience that first. And why? Well, because like I said earlier, she is the one who was called to something that no one else in history ever has been called to, nor in the future will ever be called to. There will be no other woman or man called to the same thing that Mary was called to. Mary was called to bring God into the world for the salvation of for all of humankind. And because of that, she gets the reward that not everyone else gets to enjoy, at least at this time. And so I hope that all of this kind of helps explain a little bit as to why the church made this a dogma. Yeah, it is absolutely important that the church recognize this truth as a dogma of the church. It's not just some kind of added on thing that the church decided to do because they can, but it points us further to Christ. It reveals more about God and his grace and his mercy and the true desire that he has for each and every one of us. The things that Mary got to experience at the moment of her death or at the end of her life is the exact same thing that God desires for you and me. Every single human being was intended. God wants you to be a saint. That may or may not be the case, but God absolutely wants you to be a saint with him for all of eternity, both body and soul, just as the Blessed Mother is. All right, so that's all I've got for this week. I appreciate you being here, and I know it's been a very long time since I've been here, but I'm glad to be back, and I hope to be back more consistently from here on out. So the next episode, I almost said next week's episode, but the next episode, which should be out in 2 weeks from now, from the time this video is releasing, or this podcast is releasing, 2 weeks from that point should be the last of the 4 Marian dogmas, which is Mary being the Mother of God. So I'll talk through that a little bit, explain through that a little bit, maybe talk about some arguments and some reasons why some people tend to have issues with that. But again, why it's absolutely necessary and why it makes sense that the church says that it is a dogma that Mary is the Mother of God. So with that, thank you for being here. I appreciate it. May God bless you, and I will continue to pray for you.